All right, welcome back to another episode of Phrasing FM, a podcast where I talk about languages and my experience building an app to learn them. So today I want to talk about the science behind phrasing. I've been building phrasing now for over 3 years, and one of the things I wanted to do with phrasing was draw from linguistics and memory science and second language acquisition, and take all the research I could find about how can we learn more language and put them all together in one cohesive experience and see just how far we could push the linguistic envelope. How much language can we learn? How efficiently can we learn that language? And so today I want to walk through some of the different principles that I've applied to phrasing that have had significant effects in my experience using the application, and that, backed up by the literature, can have significant impacts on the amount of language that you can learn. So I have a whole list here. This is both going to be the most prepared episode I've ever done and the most rambly or disconnected. Switching between the different topics and the reading and the speaking is a practice I don't quite have down yet. So bear with me here. There might be some pauses and some ums and some stumbling over my words. I do these all in one take though. So with that disclaimer out of the way, let's go ahead and dive into the list. So top of the list, of course, is spaced repetition. If you haven't heard of spaced repetition before, it's just the idea of showing you words at increasingly long intervals to make sure you never forget them. For example, if you see a word today, you'll see it again tomorrow, then you don't need to see it again for a week, and then you don't need to see it again for a month, and then 6 months, and then 2 years, and then 10 years. And then never again, because you have that word memorized for the rest of your life. The idea is just to find those perfect intervals where can we show you these words so that you only have to see it a couple times in your life before you have it truly memorized, like well and truly for the rest of your life memorized. And this is something that has existed for a while. It's very well studied, and it is crazy effective. Anybody can memorize anything with spaced repetition. It literally can 10x your long-term recall in any discipline, but especially languages. You'll most likely hear spaced repetition talked about with things like Anki. That's by far the most popular application. Also things like memorize. You might hear super memo. The original creators of the current models used for spaced repetition were by Peter Wozniak, who works for, or started, I believe, super memo. And so you might hear these terms thrown around. But this is something that is pretty core to the experience of phrasing. And we lean on it quite heavily. The whole experience is built around this. Because again, this can 10x your recall in any field or in any language. And one of my goals when I was building phrasing, or one of the frustrations I had, was I was a long-term Anki user, or more accurately, I was a many-time Anki user, because I would always download Anki, add my decks, start using it, love it, learn a bunch, and then stop using it. My decks would expire, and then eventually I'd miss out. I'd be missing those gains that I was getting, those linguistic gains, and I'd download it again, and I'd go through the whole process. And the thing is, if it's really that effective, why can I not keep up the habit? And every time I used it, it was just more and more apparent to me that the experience was just almost user hostile. It was very stressful to use. I did not enjoy my reviews. I did not look forward to my reviews. I could not wait for my reviews to end. And a lot of this just came down to the experience. It's not necessarily something wrong with the algorithm. Although I think one thing that many app creators get wrong is they implement the algorithm and they're like, boom, done. We have the best algorithm. We now have the best flashcards. But flashcards are so much more than just the algorithm. There's the whole experience around them. And there's a bunch of different things we'll talk about today here. But with phrasing, I really wanted to build spaced repetition that you'd actually enjoy. Flashcards that you can't put down. When I'm using phrasing, a lot of the times I'll get in this like doom loop of just one more review. I got this one wrong. I can't end on a good note. Ooh, I got this one right. I want to see what the next one is. Ooh, I can't. What's the next language? Let me just see what the next card is. And then, but I know what the next card is. So let me just continue. And I'll end up doing another 20, 30, 50 reviews in a day, just in this doom loop of one more card. And, that's the experience I want when using spaced repetition, not this idea of dreading dreading my review session, or not being able to wait until it's over, or watching the number go down and just wishing the number could go faster. And so, like I said, phrasing, it heavily incorporates spaced repetition. It can 10x your language learning if you're not already using spaced repetition. Would highly recommend it. If you've tried using spaced repetition in the past and you found that it wasn't for you, then I think phrasing might just do the trick. The next scientific principle that I want to talk about is the idea of effortful retrieval. And I'm not trying to strawman this. This is just the best way to describe it. But if you take the two different review activities of you see a list of words that you studied yesterday and you read through them, versus then having like flashcards where it's, what was this word? What's the translation of this word? What's the translation of that word? And you try to remember it. That practice of retrieving that information, thinking about it, recalling it, like forcing your brain to actually do the work, is this retrievability aspect. And so there's this idea of effortful retrieval where there is a desirable amount of difficulty that you should have when remembering something to increase your memories of different things. You don't want to just be passively reviewing information. You want to be actively engaging and actively recalling this information. And so that's something that we implement in phrasing. In this mostly just is integrated into comes naturally through the way that flashcards work. We use like close completions. So if you see a word, we'll take out one word at a time, and then we'll ask you to fill in that missing word, and you have to try to recall this information. But there are a few more steps that we go into effortful retrieval. One of them is whenever you see a word missing, we do offer you the option to type it in. So this is highly recommended, especially if it's a word that you're struggling with. This effortful retrieval of trying to write down every single words, you're just putting in that little bit more effort, and this will substantially increase your recall of a word. Sometimes I will see a word incorrectly, or I'll see a word, I won't remember it 5, 6, 10 times in a row before I'll actually go and I'll type it in. If I'm just having a lazy day, or if I'm kind of hands-free, or if I'm otherwise preoccupied. And then I go to type it in, I see the word wrong, I type in the correct answer, I get the word wrong, I see the answer, I type it in again. And then within 2 or 3 times of typing it in, I remember the word. And every time I kick myself. I'm like, why did I struggle so much just trying to remember this word just from seeing it, instead of actually going through the effort of typing it in? Another way that we implement kind of advanced effortful retrieval, so to say, is that we start by hiding one word in a sentence, and then we will hide 2 words in a sentence, and then 3 words, and then 4 words, and up to entire phrases. And so this is actually I don't know the scientific principle best to bucket this under, but this reminds me the most of effortful retrieval, because a lot of times by taking away that surrounding context, I will get a word wrong that had let's say there's the 3rd word in the sentence. If I just hide the 3rd word, a lot of times I'll get that word correctly. But if I now hide the 2nd and the 3rd word, all of a sudden I can't remember the 3rd word anymore. And that shows that I really didn't know that word. I was just forming these connections between the surrounding context. And so I'm increasing the effort that I need to do to remember these words by hiding other words. So not only does it speed up my reviews, but it actually makes them more effective and allows my brain to cheat less. So that is effortful retrieval. The third principle I want to talk about is spaced retrieval. And now this actually isn't really something very different. I just wanted to mention this because if you ever do look into the research in memory science, a lot of the times they'll be talking about spaced retrieval. And spaced retrieval is just the combination of the first two. So it's the idea of doing active recall with spaced repetition. It's a slightly more technical term. For all intensive purposes, they're interchangeable. When most people think about spaced repetition, they're thinking about spaced retrieval. That doesn't make spaced repetition wrong. It's just spaced retrieval is slightly more precise. The fourth principle I want to talk about is contextualized learning. And so this is actually an example of something that I implemented later in phrasing. I came across this research and I realized that it went against what I was doing in phrasing, and so I implemented it. And the best way to describe this is to describe what I changed in the application. So before, we used to hide a single word, and then I would give you the translation of the word that you need to fill in. And so this is non-contextualized learning. You could use the context surrounding the word, but you're getting the answer for you, or you're getting the translation of the answer in this case. And you just have to remember that translation. And so the way I implemented contextualized learning is now I don't show you the missing word. And instead, what I do is I highlight the phrase that the word belongs to and the corresponding phrase in the translation. And most of the time in phrasing, I would say over 90% of the time, phrases are multiple words. You'll get the occasional one-word phrases here and there, of course, but most words are going to be multiple phrases. And so you have to look at the translation, which is a relative translation, not a word-by-word translation. And then you have to look at the highlighted portion in the word, look at the surrounding context, figure out which words are missing from the English translation, and then try to figure out how do you complete this phrase. And so this idea of contextualized learning, or this is the idea of contextualized learning, where you have to look at the surrounding context and then figure out what the answer is instead of just doing this direct input approach. And this is crazy effective. This works so much better. It can boost your recall by 20 to 30%, depending on the study that you look at. And in phrasing, I feel like it does a lot more than that because I'm working with different phrases. But yeah, it's something that I implemented later because I came across research and it said that this is substantially better. And I implemented it, and lo and behold, it was substantially better. So that's how phrasing works now. That's how we implement contextualized learning. I will talk about the fifth and the sixth items slightly together. I'll describe the fifth principle, and this is the affective filter hypothesis. This is one of Stephen Krashen's hypotheses. And it's the idea that stress, anxiety, negative emotions, all of these bad thoughts that you might have when you're learning, when you're stressed out, they create a mental barrier that stop you from learning. They reduce the amount that you can learn because you're stressing out about them. So it's this idea of trying to make learning more enjoyable, because if you're stressed out about something, or if you're doing an activity that you find stressful, it will naturally be less effective as a learning modality. And I'm going to leave that there. That is the affective filter hypothesis. And I will describe it with the sixth principle, which is the zone of proximal development. And so the zone of proximal development is similar, but it is the idea that there is an optimal difficulty. There is an optimal amount of challenge that you should have when learning material in order to maximize your learning. If you do things that are too easy, you're not going to remember the information. If you do things too hard, you're going to be too stressed and you're not going to remember the information. And so this ties back to a little bit the effortful retrieval, but also you can see this is quite related to the affective filter hypothesis. And the way that I approach this in phrasing, or the way that I've integrated these into phrasing, are a little bit all in the same. And it's the idea that we don't use due dates in the application. What we do is we try to keep you at the zone of proximal development. So in phrasing, you can configure the difficulty target that you want. Do you want to get 75% correct, 90% correct, 60% correct? And you choose the difficulty that you want, and then we will choose words that will put you at that difficulty, or will keep you at that difficulty. If you start to outperform, or if you start to do too well, if you're getting too many cards correctly in a row, we're going to start to show you even harder cards. And if you start to do poorly, if you start to get a bunch of things wrong, we're going to show you easier cards to make sure that you're always at this engaged point. And this is something that I actually did not get from the literature. I'd heard these terms before, but it's something that I got from firsthand experience. I was looking for an Anki alternative after my 17th time quitting the application. And I was using an app called Linguistic, which I highly recommend. It was a huge inspiration for phrasing. And at the end of the sessions, what they do is they break your sessions into 50 card review chunks, like do 50 cards at a time. And then that's your reviews for the day. And some days I would struggle to get through those 50 cards. And other days, I would finish the 50 cards and be like, "Ah, come on, let's go. Let's do another 50 cards." And other times, I would just get bored. And it would be a chore, it would be a bore to finish these 50 cards. And at the end of every review session, it would show you your accuracy percentage. And I realized that every time I wanted to do a separate another deck, I would have somewhere around a 70% recall. And I thought that's strange, if it's too much lower, and not by very much. If I would just get 60, it would be massively challenging. And if I got 80, it would be incredibly boring. But, around 70% was this zone of proximal difficulty where I was super engaged and I felt like I was learning and it was fun and I wasn't stressed. And, this ties together the effective filter hypothesis, making sure that you're not bored, that you're not stressed, and also the zone of proximal development, like keeping your brain engaged at the optimal difficulty to make sure that it stays optimally challenged to learn as much as possible. And this has been super effective in phrasing. I credit it for a large reason that I get stuck in these doom loops in phrasing. And at the top of the screen, when you're using phrasing, you'll see your accuracy. And I find it really, really cool because the first couple reviews, the review bar, the accuracy bar is just jumping all over the place, going up and down because, you only have a couple words so far in your session. So it's going to average based off of those. But after 10 cards or so, I'm always blown away by how accurately it keeps me at my desired difficulty. I program it in, and without fail, every single day, I'm being held within a couple points of that optimal difficulty, which it's just, I feel like it's really cool and it's fun to watch. But the reason I bring this up is because this is a really good tool to learn when has the phrasing algorithm adapted to you. When you start using a spaced repetition application, it's not going to know all of the words that which words do you struggle with, which ones are easy. It doesn't have like a really large bank to pull from to counterbalance these weights. And so you'll see that the accuracy bar is all over the place for like the first week or two, depends on how many reviews you do. And of course, whether every card is new and challenging for you or whether there's a little bit of a spread. But after 1 to 2 weeks, you'll start to notice that this accuracy bar is getting closer and closer and closer and staying longer and longer and longer right on target. And when you see that accuracy bar is staying on target, that's when you know that the phrasing algorithm has adapted to you and that you're in business. So if you're using phrasing, the first couple days can be a little rough. That's just the experience of using a spaced repetition algorithm in the beginning. But very quickly it learns this and it keeps you at that zone of proximal development. And that it really does reduce your stress and negative emotions that you might have with language learning. So you get a two for one with this implementation, the effective filter hypothesis and the zone of proximal development. The next principle I want to talk about is number 7, the tolerance of ambiguity. This is a really important concept when it comes to learning a foreign language, and it's exactly what it sounds like. How well can you tolerate ambiguity? When you're learning a foreign language, or even more importantly, when you're speaking a foreign language, there's going to be tons of ambiguity for a very long time. Even once you can speak a language at an extremely competent level, there's going to be times where there's just really high levels of ambiguity. You're dealing with new accents, you're dealing with loud environments, you're dealing with slang, people are slurring their words or not articulating, and you have to be able to deal with that ambiguity. And if you don't expose yourself to ambiguous situations, if you work in these very sanitary educational contexts where you can hear everything perfectly clearly, people are speaking really slowly to you, you know every single word, they're using really simple grammar and structures, you're never exposing yourself. You're never building your tolerance of ambiguity. And tolerance of ambiguity is strongly, strongly correlated to success in learning a foreign language. And tolerance of ambiguity is also something that can be trained. And so this is a massive part of phrasing as well. And the way that it's implemented is with the longer expressions. So you'll see me recommend very often to use expressions that are between 15 and 20 words long. And this is very different from any other application where you'll oftentimes see, cards as short as 3 or 4 or 5, maybe 6 or 7 words is starting to get really long for like an Anki card or something like that. And with phrasing, we use these really, really long words. And we also use the contextualized learning before, where we're not giving you the exact answer, to just throw you into these ambiguous states, to get you used to dealing with ambiguity. If you say a word enough times, it just becomes random sounds. Um, And so when you're seeing these longer expressions over and over and you can't follow them all and you're seeing these phrases and you don't have the right answer and you have to piece them apart, you're learning and you're building your tolerance of ambiguity. You can find the answer in all of these. Phrasing contains more than enough information to get to the end of the answer. But the important thing is that you're starting from this ambiguous state and you're working your way through it. And this is the bread and butter of phrasing to some extent. I mean, spaced repetition is, but this is one of the really, really core concepts of it, and something that I think a lot of language learning solutions in general, not just applications, but textbooks, classes, courses, instruction, all of them, they're always trying to remove the ambiguity to get you to this point where you feel like you know everything. But then you go to use the language and you know that you don't know everything. And so it's just kind of embracing from day one that there will be these ambiguous situations and getting used to dealing with it and training your brain that, don't panic. This is fine. You've worked through this ambiguity the entire time that you've been learning this language. You know that the context clues are there. You know you can piece it out and that it doesn't start to stress you and doesn't start to overwhelm you. That's very important for language learning. I think in general, that's something that so many different language learning solutions miss the mark on. And I feel like that's a big reason of why a lot of people will learn a language for years, feel like they have a good grasp on it, and then can't speak with a native speaker. And I don't think it's out of stress or fear. I think it's just this ambiguity is just something that's foreign to them because they haven't built up this tolerance. So that's number 7. One more time for the record, tolerance of ambiguity, before we move on to number 8. Which is the 8th one, the 8th principle, category induction. So category induction is about the brain's innate ability to unconsciously extract grammatical patterns from repeated examples. So instead of having to have a grammar pattern explained to you and then go through exercises where you build it up in a very clean, sanitary environment where you know everything, just seeing it in a bunch of different contexts your brain will automatically start to unpack this. This is very similar to how this would describe quite well, I should say, how mass exposure works. So if you hear people talk about the comprehensible input approach or language acquisition or ALG or dreaming Spanish or any of these methods, a lot of these are relying on this principle of category induction, that if you just are exposed to enough instances of these patterns, you will subconsciously ingrain these rules. And this is not magic. This is just what our brain does all the time. This is how we all learned our first language. If you have ever learned a foreign language and you're talking with a native speaker and they say something very strange and you say, wait, why is it like that? They give you this super confused expression because we do not understand the grammar in our own language for the most part. Most of us do not understand the grammar that we use in every single sentence. It's just something that makes sense to us. It's something that we have induced, that we have used category induction to ingrain into our speech. And this is something that you can take advantage of and something that phrasing takes advantage of. I have a podcast episode that I released before called Grammar is Retrospective. And that goes more into my philosophy on grammar. But in phrasing, every word is explained. All the grammar pieces are explained. All the phrases are explained. Everything is explained. So if you want an answer to why something is the way it is, we have an answer for you. But we use that in a retrospective manner. So we don't start with the grammar and say, here's a couple examples. Now we're going to do some exercises on this. Look for this clue. We just show you patterns. And you might say, why is this like this? And you look at it and you get an answer and you move on. And after seeing these patterns for a couple different times, you'll just pick it up. I remember I could not, for the life of me, make sense of a grammatical pattern in phrasing. There was just one example of it, and every time it came up, it just didn't make sense to me. It just didn't click. This idea of like like you can use a verb and it means when somebody does this, and I don't know what it was. It was just not clicking for me. And so I created a couple different expressions that use this grammar pattern, and just random ones. I didn't cover every case and every ending. I just used this grammar pattern in multiple expressions. And within a month or two, this grammar pattern is I look at it and I'm like, how did this ever confuse me? This just makes so much sense. And it's just that if you expose yourself to uses of grammar patterns, they'll make so much more sense than trying to prescriptively learn them and wrap your head around all of them and try to piece them together. So that is number 8, category induction. The way we implement it is just having grammar as this retrospective thing that you do. It's not a prospective thing. We don't have grammar lessons. We don't segment things by grammar. Just use native level sentences. They'll use all the grammar pieces that you need, and have enough examples of them. Have them clearly explained so you're never feeling lost, and you will just naturally pick up these grammar patterns. And so number 9 is contextual variability. And that's just the idea that seeing information in different contexts provides a much deeper understanding of it. It's very closely tied to category induction, but it's slightly different. And we have a slightly different, I have a slightly different way that I've interpreted it and implemented it. And that is with the idea of the language graph. So whenever you add an expression to phrasing, it breaks it down into different words. But we go one step further than that. That's kind of opaque at times. And that we then find other uses of those words and we connect them. We find subwords within those, so different roots within the word, and we connect words across those roots. We find the characters that share the same characters. We find the headword, the dictionary, the lemma, and we connect it across those as well. And we create this very rich web, this graph of language. So if you get a word wrong, or if you see a word in a review, the next time you see it, it might be in a different context. It might be in a different expression, because we know that this is the same word used the same way, just in a different context. And so we're constantly switching between these different contexts for the same word, which just allows you to get a substantially better understanding of the word. And I mean substantially. If you are struggling with a word in phrasing and you add just a second expression with that word, the clarity that you get on how this word is used is remarkable. I mean, something just magical happens with 2 or 3 different instances of this word. I think it was Matt versus Japan says that once you have 7 use cases of a word, then you've covered all your bases. But really, I think that's a high number. Maybe that's the highest you need for some crazy words in other languages. 2 or 3 is really sufficient to get a really good understanding of the word and how it's used. Of course, the top 100 common words, they might need more examples of that, but those will cover themselves naturally. The words that you'll be struggling to learn, just 2 or 3 different instances of them and cycling them out and just varying this context makes it substantially more, it makes the memories much more substantial. It makes the words feel much more complete, and it just makes them so much easier to remember. So that is number 9, contextual variability. And then there is number 10, the encoding variability hypothesis. And so this one sounds a lot like contextual variability. It has the same word, but this one is quite different in how it takes shape in phrasing. And so it's the idea that your memories will be much stronger if there are various different ways that you've saved this information in your brain. Now, this is kind of, as I said, like contextual variability. If you have different words in different contexts, then yes, you encode it in different ways, and that's good. But we go one step further than that, because the way this comes up more is having seen the words on screen, hearing the words play back, see the words synced up in time, like karaoke style. As the audio plays, it highlights the current word that's being spoken. Then recalling the word, typing in the word, and reading the explanations. Then also opening up the phrases and seeing these expressions as sets of phrases and how these words fit into the phrases. you start to then, and also we have phrases and we have chunks. So there's actually two different ways that we group these. And you're no longer just trying to remember this word and its translation, but you're remembering the sounds of it. You're remembering how it's spelled. You're remembering the explanations, how it relates to the word, how it relates to the chunk, and all of these different ways to save the information. And when it comes to understanding the word, we explain what it means, some different alternatives. We decompose it into its different affixes and its different roots. We explain the grammar behind it. We go over all this different information, and we give you so much information to save. There's so much encoding variability. There's so many different pieces for you to latch onto as you're learning this information. And this is why I always recommend reading through the full description of the word, all of the explanations. If you come across a new word, try to at least once when you see the word, just read through all of the explanations. It only takes a couple seconds, and there's almost always something in there that your brain can just latch onto. And it just will massively improve your recall. And then as the audio goes through, don't just look at the word that you need to type in and think about the word, but follow along with the audio. See what words are being underlined. Like, hear the audio for it. If you get a word wrong a bunch, you can play the audio on repeat for a given word, or a word and its surroundings. Play that on repeat. Practice speaking it. Practice repeating it. The idea of just producing the sounds with your mouth, like using your muscles to make this word instead of your brain to write it down, is just another form of encoding variability. So you're hearing it, you're speaking it, you're reading about it, you're decomposing it, you're seeing how it relates to the different phrases. All of these different ways to save it just make it a substantially stronger memory. And so that is number 10, the encoding variability hypothesis. And then we get to number 11. And number 11 is my favorite one on this list. It's the one I talk about way too often. It's the unsung hero of phrasing. And, well, I mean, I guess I sing it all the time, but it's the unsung hero of language learning. That is the sung hero of phrasing. And that is interleaving. Interleaving is the idea of mixing up your reviews. And what I mean by this, well, the best way to describe this is with languages. So if you're learning two languages, let's say you're learning French and Spanish. If you do an hour of French and an hour of Spanish, that is called blocked practice. That is the opposite of interleaving. Interleaving would be the idea of doing a couple minutes of French, then a couple minutes of Spanish, then a couple minutes of French, then a couple minutes of Spanish. You are interleaving the contexts, the topics that you are learning. And this has dramatic effects on your recall. This can up to double your recall in some fields or in some research papers. And it is probably the thing that gets the most pushback on phrasing from first-time users, but gets the most praise from long-time users. A lot of people try to separate their languages as much as possible when they are learning them. And you're really leaving a lot on the table when you do that, because not only can you increase your recall by up to 50%, which is an insane amount, just by shuffling your deck. Instead of doing them all at once, you just shuffle it and you'll remember 50% more. I mean, that sounds like magic. That sounds like too good to be true. So not only do you just get this automatic benefit, but you also practice what's called linguistic discrimination. You practice the ability to discern which words belong to which languages. A lot of people, and I mean, most people really, worry that when they start doing this, they are going to just mix up the languages. If you're just doing the different languages all mixed together, it's just going to end up as one language in your head, and you're not going to know the difference between them, which could not be further from the truth. This is the ability to not mix up languages, the ability to distinguish between them is a skill. And it is a skill that needs training and it needs practice. And what a lot of people do is they never work on this skill. They try to separate their study by as much as possible, and then they mix up these languages and they wonder why. And then they try to separate them even more to make them even more clear in their head. But the way I approach it and the way it's approached in phrasing is mix them up and learn to distinguish the languages from day one. And this is not only just backed up by the literature, it's also backed up by some very poignant personal anecdotes. The first language I started learning was French. And very shortly after, I added Italian, and I studied French and Italian at the same time. And I always like to say that Italian is just French grammar with Spanish words, being a little bit trite. I mean, I don't speak Spanish, but everybody in my Italian class did speak Spanish and they knew all the words. I spoke some French and I knew all of the grammar, and it just stuck in my head that way. And I studied these languages. I had them at a very similar level for maybe 2 years when I was studying them in school. And I never mixed up French and Italian. Maybe very rarely I'd mix up a word or two. But for the most part, the only mix-ups that I would really do is I would not know a word in Italian, and so I would just Italianize the French word, or I wouldn't know a word in French, and so I would just Frenchify the Italian word. And honestly, most of the time, it actually worked out. It probably worked out more often than it didn't. But I never accidentally mixed them up. It wasn't something that I struggled to distinguish between these two languages, and that's because I was studying them at the same time. I was studying them together. I was interleaving my study of them. Fast forward 10 years, and I started to learn Dutch. Now, at this point, I hadn't touched French in a very long time. And I started to learn Dutch, which is a different language family. And even to this day, I have a lot of difficulty distinguishing between Dutch and French. I cannot easily switch between these languages. It is remarkably difficult for me. And for the longest time, when I was learning, in the beginning, when I was learning Dutch, if somebody would speak French to me, because I was in Amsterdam and sometimes I'd run across French speakers, I would start to say a sentence in French, and they'd look at me really confused, and I'd have to play back what I said, and I'd realize that at some point in the sentence, I would just switch to Dutch. So I'd start saying something in French, and by the end of the sentence, who knows when, I had switched completely to Dutch. And then after that, I'd try to say something in Dutch, and I'd get another confused look, and I'd realize that at some point in the sentence, I had switched to French. And it's just, they completely fused in my brain where I had no ability to distinguish them, despite them being different language families that I knew to very different levels, separated by over a decade of experience, or a decade of time, and learned in incredibly different contexts, learned in different countries, entirely different periods in my life. I still mix them up. And that's because I never practiced my discrimination. I never practiced my ability to discern between the two languages. And so for that reason, interleaving is very important to me. It's something that I find, especially if you're learning multiple languages, not only do you get this benefit of just learning more for free, but you get this benefit of being able to distinguish between the languages, which is really important. It's really embarrassing when you start speaking another language and you switch to another language the other person doesn't speak in the middle of the sentence. It's not a good feeling to have. I want to avoid that at all costs. And while using phrasing has not done wonders for my French and Dutch discrimination, just because I haven't done enough reviews in these languages, it has done wonders for several other languages, most notably Croatian and Macedonian. I'm learning both Croatian and Macedonian on phrasing, and I do not mix up these two languages. Occasionally, I'll try to use a word from one of the languages in the other word and just assume that it's going to be the same. But that's allowed. That it's an intentional, I don't know if this is going to be a Macedonian word, but I know it is in Croatian, and they're pretty dang similar, so let's just give it a shot. And sometimes I'm wrong on that. I'm definitely wrong on that more than French than I was with French and Italian. But for the most part, I can separate these languages very well in my head, despite learning them and several other languages in an interleaved fashion. And, Macedonian, I have only studied with phrasing in an interleaved fashion with Croatian and all my other languages. And Croatian, I did like 2 months of study 8 years ago. I never really learned the language. So I can't say that it is a purely phrasing language, but for all intents and purposes, it's a purely phrasing language. And this has been just incredibly convenient and incredibly effective. And, the number one thing I wish I could get into people's brains is to try interleaving. Approach it with what's the word that I'm looking for? Approach it with an open mind and give it a shot. And I think you'll be shocked at not only how effective it is, but actually just at how effective it is, full stop. So that is number 11. That is interleaving. Then number 12 is batching. So if interleaving scared you off, fear not, because there is also batching. Originally, I built the algorithm to work with a configurable number. So, you know, the best interleaving is not necessarily a perfect shuffle where you're always seeing a different review every single time. You're never getting in the flow of the language that way. And so you do want to see some amount of reviews in the same language without switching. I'm not sure that that necessarily does anything wonders for your recall, but it does wonders for your attention span. And so the way that the algorithm was originally built was you could turn on batching and you choose how many reviews you want to do, let's say 20 reviews in a language, and then it would switch languages after those 20 reviews. And, first I built the algorithm, it was just a pure shuffle, and then I built the batching and I turned on batching, and something unexpected happened once I did that. I had been using the application in the purely interleaved fashion, and it was always so exciting. When a new Arabic expression came up, I'd say, ooh, Arabic, this is one of my favorite languages. And then Turkish would come up, and ooh, Turkish, this is one of my favorite languages. And I was always so excited by whichever language came up. It was like a Christmas morning, every single review. And then I turned on batching, and, Arabic would come up, and I'd say, ooh, Arabic, this is one of my favorite languages. And then the next card was Arabic, and I was like, oh yeah, Arabic. And by like the third or fourth card in Arabic, I was just bored. And I felt like I was doing my reviews and I had to get my Arabic done with so I could get to the next exciting language, which is preposterous because it didn't matter which language came up or how excited I was by the first card. By like card 5 or even card 3, like just knowing that I had 10 or 15 or 20 more to do, it just made it so boring. And even if I lowered the batching all the way down to 3, it was still just, it took away some of the magic. And this is, I would attribute this to dopaminergic principles. So when it was just random cards, I didn't know what the next one was going to be. So it was always exciting. And it gave me this little boost of dopamine on every single review. Where once I took that away, I took away that dopaminergic response, and it just very quickly became flashcards and study that I had to get through. So for that reason, I don't necessarily recommend turning on batching. It's still a feature in phrasing if you want to use it, if that's how you like to study. But what I did instead was I implemented language momentum. And so this is just kind of like automatic batching, where we will show you words in a very secretly batched manner. So we don't explain it. Sometimes they're going to be perfectly shuffled. Sometimes you're going to see quite a few cards in the same language. And we try to do that in a way to keep you as engaged as possible, but show you as long and contiguous sequences in a language as possible. So balancing that dopamine principle, but also giving you this batching principle. Batching is also, I got this actually from Benjamin Keep, who is, I guess you could say, science communicator. I think he's also a memory researcher, but I've never been able to find good studies to back this up. This is something that I kind of just took him at his word on. I'm sure he has studies for it that, I'm sure he's not making this up, but I can't exactly quote this one. I've tried to find it, but I can't find any good studies for me to back it up. But it is something that is implemented and, something that is asked for. But I would recommend sticking with the language momentum. Just try the interleaving and see if that is enough for you. So that is number 12, batching. Number 13 is spacing. And so spacing is just the idea that doing several smaller review sessions is better than one big review session. And this is a little bit of a debate in spaced repetition circles. How many times should you do flashcards per day? Should you just do them once per day? Should you do them twice per day, 3 times per day, every other day? Is there an optimal frequency with which you should do your reviews? And according to memory science, it says that spacing is really good. According to spaced repetition, it says that doing it once a day is sufficient and that people don't outperform spaced repetition, or you don't do better if you do multiple sessions in a day versus one session. I tend to lean towards the former camp, the spacing, that doing reviews multiple times a day is just, for me, I find it to be wildly more effective for language learning, especially with language learning. Just there's so much that you're picking up, and especially with the phrasing method, like there's all of the grammar patterns, the pronunciation, the words, the phrases, all of this, that the more you can pick it up, you're always going to get something new. And depending on how you're feeling at any given moment, you're going to be picking up different information. And so phrasing was largely built to be used multiple times throughout the day. The, I really wanted an application that if you had 2 minutes in the elevator, instead of opening up Instagram, you'd take out phrasing to just get like 4 or 5 reviews done. If you have, if you're standing in line, if you're on the bus, if you have hands free, if you're behind the computer, like no matter what it is, I just want people to be able to fill in their time with phrasing. And that's part of the reason that I consolidated so many review modalities into Command, so that no matter your attention, like there's just less decision. It works whether you want to type things in, it works whether you want just buttons, it works whether you want to be quick, it works whether you want to go really slowly. There's just one thing, you just open it up and you do your reviews. That was also a big driver behind the sync engine that I recently did. So I recently developed a new sync engine for the application. This is getting more engineering technical, but this allows the application to, one, work offline. So if you're in an elevator with poor reception, you can keep using the application while you're in the elevator. And two, it allows for instant page loads. So the page should load in under a second. If you have a smaller account, much faster than under a second every single time. And so you can get from 0 to reviews offline in less than 2 seconds. And the idea there is like just reduce the amount of friction between you and your reviews so that you can do reviews more times throughout the day, that you can just pick it up when you have a couple spare minutes. Because even those small little intervals where you try to get a word, a lot of times I'll get a word wrong. It keeps coming up in auxiliaries. I'm not learning it. I'll do something else. And then I'll come back and I'll pick up the phone and I'll do 5 reviews and I'll remember all of the auxiliary words. And it just, I can feel it ingraining in my brain. Maybe that's me kidding myself, but I found it to be just really effective for language learning. So the algorithm, the application, the engineering, it's all designed and optimized to be used as many times as possible throughout the day. Of course, if you just use it once a day, if you use it every other day, that's going to be fine. You really should be using it more than every 3 days, though, at least every other day, just to keep the algorithm fresh. But yeah, that is number 13. That is spacing. And then number 14 is the input hypothesis, another hypothesis by Stephen Krashen. And this is the idea that language acquisition occurs primarily through comprehensible input just above your level. He'll often call this I plus 1. So your level just plus 1, just a little bit higher. As long as you're being exposed to content at that level, you will automatically start to pick up the language. You will do your category induction and you will piece apart the different bits of the language. And Stephen Krashen makes a pretty bold claim that this is the only way to learn a language. And he is also quite anti-flashcards. And most people in this camp are quite anti-flashcards or anti-space repetition. And so how the heck do I implement language acquisition, the input hypothesis, into phrasing? And I have a whole podcast episode about this as well. I believe it is called Atomic Language Acquisition. And I have my own novel hypothesis that piggybacks off of this a little bit. And it is best described with a question, and that is, how long does content have to be before it is considered input? So Stephen Krashen says you just need input, just watch enough movies, listen to enough talks, and you'll pick up the language. Flashcards don't work because they're not input. And so my question is, at what point does content become input? A 2-hour-long movie is input, a 30-minute TV show is input, a 10-minute video essay is input, a 3-minute short is, I think most people would still consider input. A 30-second TikTok, some people are considering that input. And so where is the line between input and no longer input? There are a bunch of criticisms of the input hypothesis. One of them being is that it's very unfalsifiable. And this is one of the unfalsifiable things, is that like if you didn't use the correct content, it just, it's input if it worked, and if it didn't work, then it's not input, which doesn't make for a very robust scientific principle. However, my hypothesis for what makes input is if you cannot remember the beginning by the time you get to the end, then it is input. And so with phrasing, we work with expressions. And as I've mentioned before earlier in this podcast and everywhere in the marketing site and probably in every other podcast, I recommend expressions to be around 15 to 20 words long. This is because when they are this long, if you play back the audio and you're trying to follow along, by the time you get to the end of the sentence, you're not going to be able to repeat back the beginning of the sentence. You're not going to be able to remember the beginning. And so it puts you into kind of this asynchronous flow where you have to process the information as it comes in. You can't be trying to hold everything in your head. It's this, you're processing it sequentially. You're processing it like input. And this dragging something out just to that point where you can no longer repeat back the beginning of the sentence by the time you get to the end of it. To me, I think that's what makes input. And that's one of the things that makes phrasing so effective, is that it allows for the benefits of language acquisition, benefits of input hypothesis, while also leveraging the benefits of spaced repetition. So you get the benefits of both sides of these. And this is a lot of the things that you'll hear, the benefits of input hypothesis, the benefits of the input hypothesis, or of language acquisition, which is the implementation or the practice of implementing the input hypothesis, I guess one would say. The feedback that you hear from people who use this method is very similar to the feedback that I'm hearing from users on phrasing, where, hold on, sorry about that. I had to cough. It's allergy season where I am. Anyways, the feedback that I hear from users is very similar to that from people who use or who rely on the input hypothesis. And that's that they're able to understand native speakers so much better. They're able to pick out the words that they do know. They're able to segment the words that they don't know. They're able to use the vocabulary that they've heard in a much more, or that they've learned through phrasing in a much more natural manner. One of the biggest criticisms you'll hear of phrasing, or of, one of the biggest criticisms that you'll hear of things like Anki or spaced repetition is that you'll learn a word and you'll know it very well in your Anki reviews, and every time it comes up, you don't struggle with it whatsoever. But then when it comes to use it in practice, or when you hear the word, you're completely lost and you can't recall it or you can't understand it. Where this is not the case with language acquisition, and this is also not the case with phrasing. And when I ratcheted up my French for a little bit when I went to France, it was crazy effective, where I could just start using almost every word I learned in context, and I'd pick them out when people are using them. And I attribute it largely to these longer expressions, to this input, to leveraging the input hypothesis in spaced repetition, where you're getting the benefits of both. You can get the algorithmic control, but you can get the natural, the naturalness, the acquisition promised by the input hypothesis. So that's number 14, the input hypothesis. And then we move on to number 15, which is extensive reading. So extensive reading is just this idea of, it's a way to learn language through reading. Basically finding comprehensible text and just exposing yourself to a really large quantity of this and reading. It can be an incredibly effective way to learn new vocabulary. This is often proposed as an alternative to spaced repetition. And I would say on the list, this is probably the weakest link to phrasing. This is something that I've always found interesting and I want to implement more. However, I do find if we circle back to the point above, I think it was about contextualized learning, when you don't see the translation of the word, you have this long expression that's a little bit intimidating. You see the highlighted phrase, you see the other words in the phrase. You have to tap around on this phrase to read through to see how it comes together. I do find a benefit of this that is very similar to reading a book in a foreign language. It's not quite the same as extensive reading. Like reading a 20-word expression is not the same as reading an entire novel. I'm not making that claim. However, there is a lot more active reading that goes on when you are using phrasing, just in normal review mode, almost as an incidental way of how the application works. And so I do believe you get some benefits of extensive reading. Although, as I said, I do want to implement this one more in the future, and I've got some got some good ideas on this one. So that is number 15, extensive reading, and then number 16, and we just have two more before we get through this list, and these ones are also related. And I would love to make this one the last one on the list, but you'll see why the last one on the list has to be the last one on the list. And this is the idea of just phrases in general and multi-word units or multi-word expressions or collocations. And there is very strong evidence to support that learning multi-word units substantially outperforms learning words or full sentences. And so this is where phrasing gets its name. This is one of the core features of phrasing. When you give it an expression, it breaks it into phrases, and you learn expressions through phrases. And you're trying to learn these expressions just as these individual points. This is not only more effective for using them, as when we speak, we're not thinking one word at a time, but we're often thinking in larger phrases, larger groups. And the point of phrasing is to get you to the point in a foreign language where you're using these larger groups yourself, where you're starting to look for these larger groups, where you're internalizing these larger groups. So everything you're interacting with is basically on a phrase-by-phrase basis. This actually reminds me of something I should have mentioned with the input hypothesis. And the input hypothesis has this idea of I+1. So you always want to be doing something just outside your current level. You don't want to be doing something crazy outside your current level. And when you have a long, complicated expression, that is many times above your current level. If there are 10 words you don't know, it's I+10, or if there's more grammar patterns, then even higher. But when you focus on just learning phrases, this is oftentimes just going to be, I+1 or I+2 above your level. It doesn't, the input hypothesis doesn't have to be exactly I+1. Another critique of it is that you can't really measure I+1. It doesn't necessarily just mean one word that you don't know. It's just right above your level. And if you're learning a 3-word phrase, that's basically I+1, regardless of where your I is. Wherever your current level is, 3 words above that is not going to be too difficult. And so breaking things into phrases, it makes it a lot easier to understand complicated expressions. It makes it a lot easier to stay at an I+1 level at all the times. It allows us to do the contextualized learning. It allows us to do so many things that we've done previously. And it also allows us to use relative translations. And so I'm going to do a whole podcast episode about this. But one of the things you'll hear from a lot of language learners is that they want to stop translating in their head, or they've been studying for a long time and they're always translating in their head, and they want to stop doing this. And I think this comes from always dealing with really high quality learning materials, or more than high quality, but like extremely sanitary learning materials, where you're dealing with very accurate translations from one language to the next, like more accurate than would be natural. So if you take an English sentence and you want to translate it into Chinese, they're not going to be very accurate. Like if you were to translate them word by word, they're going to be quite different. And so by learning from phrases, the phrases, they do tend to match up pretty well. The words inside the phrases are going to be different, but phrases are these general semantic chunks. So it allows us to align them much better across different languages. And so when you're learning from these phrases, you're learning these relative translations. You're not learning these one-to-one pairings between the two languages. You're learning, how do I say this expression? How do I say this collocation in this language? And to me, it allows you to skip what I call the proto-language. I have a whole nother podcast episode on that. It allows you to skip this whole stage of translating in your head. It allows you to stay at the right level. And there's a reason I made a whole app called Phrasing. Phrases are incredibly, incredibly important to how we speak and how we process and how we understand languages. And I think it serves to reason that they're very important for learning a language as well. But that is number 16, just phrases in general. And I want to close on number 17, which is very similar to number 16. And this is linguistic chunks. And this is very near and dear to my favorite feature in the application. So when you are interacting with a word in phrasing, when you're doing the reviews, we are highlighting phrases. These are just semantic chunks that can be aligned across different languages. And, they're buckets of meaning that are going to be similar across all the different languages. However, we also have this feature, which I call the shapes feature, which is when you open this up, it opens up the entire expression in a color-coded view with pronunciation and word-by-word translations and so much more information. And it's split again into phrases. But to the keen observer, you might notice that the phrases in the shapes view are slightly different from the phrases when you are tapping around on the word in another view. And that's because this is the idea of linguistic chunks. So it's pretty well researched in linguistics that we process language sequentially. Words come in, we store their meaning. New words come in, we update the meaning of what's being said. We're never, there are some phrases that will have multiple words in between them. We're normally not waiting in our head for that last word to resolve the meaning of the first word that we heard. I don't know if that made sense. I feel like that was kind of a bad explanation. But basically, the idea is to find even simpler than phrases. Like, what are the different little multi-word chunks that we can break a language into that we can break down in an expression for you to learn from? Basically, when you are hearing the sentence, how should your brain be processing it? As each word comes in, how do you understand it? How should you understand it? And so if you're ever confused about an entire expression, you can open up the shapes view and you can click around and you can see, okay, this is how I should be processing this longer sentence, which it's just hard to, it's hard to even explain how effective this is for learning a language, especially for more complicated languages, or I should say more foreign languages. So if the word order, if the sentence structure is very different from your own, if the translations are not very direct, if they're very relative, not very literal translations, this makes it so easy to navigate a sentence and bigger take this much bigger expression and break it down into understandable parts. And this is actually why the expressions are recommended to be 15 to 20 words long. The upper bound there is actually because this is more coming to hypothesis, but there is plenty of studies that show we are capable of holding 7 items in our short-term memory. Pretty reliably, pretty much everyone can hold 7. Sometimes 6, sometimes normally not more than 7. Most people hold 7 most of the time, and then occasionally some people might hold like 6 or 5, but that's not consistent. Everybody will most often be able to hold 7 items in their short-term memory. And when you have an expression that is 7 chunks long, I feel like in the beginning, it's very overwhelming, but eventually you can get to this aha moment. Once you understand enough of these words, you don't hold every individual word in your head because it's too long to do that, but you can hold these chunks in your head, which is, it just provides this experience of, you'll struggle with a sentence for so long and it's just a bunch of big words and this isn't making sense and you get the grammar, but like it sounds like a bunch of sounds. And then one day, maybe 2 months into using phrasing, 2 months after you see an expression, it'll just click and you'll hear the sentence and you'll say, wait a minute, I know every word in this. I know how this all fits together. This all makes so much sense. I can repeat the whole thing. And it's just this aha moment that if I could bottle that up, I would. It's a very cool experience. And to me, this comes down to chunks. Like you need to only have 7 chunks in an expression for you to get to this aha moment, or 7 phrases. And so that's why I recommend 20-word expressions on the higher end, because it gives you the longest time until you get here, but these chunks are normally around 3 words on average. And so you can eventually get to the point where you can understand a much longer piece through these 7 sentences, or through these 7 chunks. And it helps you practice grouping words with each other, because when we're speaking a language, if I say on the other hand, I'm not thinking about the individual words what that is, or like, you know what I mean? Like these are not individual words. These are just, they're so connected when we use them. They're so automatic. that the app tries to break down um, or tries to group words into these chunks and teach you how to understand expressions via them. So that is number 17. That is linguistic chunks. I just wanted to touch on that because phrases and chunks are what make the application what it is. They're by far my favorite part of the application, and they're slightly different. When you click around on an expression, you'll see the phrases. When you open up the shapes, you'll see the chunks. You can, of course, switch between these in the shapes view. Currently, I don't know when you're listening to this, but at the moment, if you select a word and deselect it, you'll see an option to switch between the chunks and the phrases. So you can see the different ways that it breaks down across the two. But with these two, it gives you such an ability to make sense of such complicated expressions from day one. It's really cool. It helps you understand sentence structure, word order, and just word grouping and chunking and all of these different principles that are normally quite automatic or require a very high level before you start to build. I mean, you can start building this literally from day one, which is not only cool, but it is really essential to using a language to any level of proficiency. So never too late to get started there. And with that, that is 17 scientific principles that I have been leaning on when building phrasing. A lot of these are shown to increase your recall by ridiculous amounts. I mean, 20, 30, 50%. And when you start to tack these onto one another, I think there's a very high ceiling of how much you can learn on a language when you put these all together. And my experience with phrasing has definitely been that's the case. So hopefully this was interesting to you. If you're still at this point of the episode, then thank you for staying here the whole time. I'll try to get the studies posted, and if you have any questions, please feel free to leave them in the comments below. And if you want to try any of these out, you can try them out on Phrasing.app. There is a free demo tier that you can use, some demo expressions to get a feel for the application. And then when you're ready to take your language learning to the next level, you can create your own expressions from anything, from any text, movies, books, songs. We don't do the conversion automatically, but just copy paste the text into the application, and we can turn anything into an expression. So you get all the benefits of everything listed above. Thank you very much for listening this long, and have a great day. Ciao.